G'day everyone. Sorry we're running a little bit late this morning. We've had a few technical difficulties. My name's Ebony Bennett, for those of you who don't know. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our Economics of a Pandemic webinar series. As I said, we are having a few technical difficulties this morning, so I do apologise that we're running a few minutes late, but I can see our attendees streaming in as we speak, heading up towards 500, and we had about 1,300 people, I think, register for this event today. So welcome to you all. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. The Australia Institute is a Canberra-based think tank, and Canberra is Ngunnawal country. I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and pay my respects to elders past and present, and also ask everyone to recommit to the process that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people came together to ask for in the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a process that asks for us to work towards a voice to Parliament and a Makarrata Commission that would oversee agreement making as well as a process of truth-telling about Australia's history. Well, more than 20,000 people have registered for the Australia Institute's Economics of a Pandemic webinar series over the past couple of months since we began. And I want to thank you all for joining us on these adventures. We've been delighted to be able to bring you so many special guests and to cover such a range of, issues. For those unfamiliar with us, the Australia Institute is an independent public policy think tank based in Canberra. And during the pandemic, we are aiming to do these webinars at least once a week, but days and times do vary. So please make sure that you check our website at tai.org.au for all the latest webinars that you can register for so that you don't miss out. And just a few tips before we do begin to help things run today. If you hover over the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you should be able to type in questions for our panelists today. And you should also be able to upvote questions from other people and make comments on their questions as well. We will take questions in the second half of this webinar. And if you'd like to ask your question live to the panel, sorry, my light's just blinking a bit there. You can use the raise your hand function and we'll call on you in the second half of the webinar to do that. And make sure that you keep things civil in the chat and on topic, otherwise you will be removed. And lastly, a reminder that this is being recorded and we'll make the video recording available after this webinar is complete. I believe we've also got Allan Gyngell joining us now, but Allan, I can see there and you're just on mute. Hang on one moment. Can you just see if you can unmute yourself there,
yeah.
Allan? Can you hear us?
Well done. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Excellent. Thank you so much. So to kick off today's discussion, the pandemic really has caused massive disruption to our lives, to the movement of people and to the global economy, and perhaps the biggest disruption, I guess, since we've seen since World War II. And since then, we've had, I guess, numerous other wars, but quite apart from that conflict, we have tended to use war as a metaphor, and it's crept into how we talk about public policy. And today we wanted to talk about how misrepresenting policy issues as security problems doesn't help solve them, yet many public policy issues are framed using this lens. We've had a war on drugs, wars on poverty, on red tape, yet when it comes to the conflict in Yemen, we don't tend to describe that as a war. So to discuss how securitisation, not in the financial sense, but in a public policy sense, can turn policy issues and problems into threats, I'm delighted to introduce our guests today, Allan Gyngell and Allan Behm. Allan Gyngell has had a long and distinguished career of public service. He had DFAT postings in Rangoon, Singapore and Washington. He moved to Prime Minister in Cabinet and was asked to be Prime Minister Paul Keating's foreign policy advisor and left government in 1996. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd asked him to be the Director-General of ONA, which he did until 2013. And he became the inaugural director of the Lowy Institute in 2003. He's co-author of the book, The Making of Foreign Policy with Michael Wesley, as well as the book, Fear of Abandonment, and was elected national president of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. And it's in that capacity that he's joining us today. And Allan Behm is the head of the Australian Institute's International and Security Affairs program. He's got extensive experience in international policy, national security policy and defence policy. He was Greg Combay's Chief of Staff in the Rudd and Gillard governments, dealing with climate change, which is obviously a truly strategic issue. And recently he was Penny Wong's Senior Foreign Policy Advisor. He's also the inaugural chair of the Canberra Writers Festival and remains a board member of Fearless, a not-for-profit that addresses the needs of those many Australians who live with PTSD. G'day, Allan, and welcome to you both.
Thanks, Ebony.
So, Allan Gyngell, I will kick off with you, I guess, for this conversation. Just briefly to kick us off, what is this phenomenon of securitisation and why is it a concern?
In some ways, securitisation is a very 21st century phenomenon. Mostly during the second half of the 20th century, which is when I began my career, war, whether hot war or cold war, was used to describe the actual issues relating to fighting conflicts and to preventing them, so arms control and so on. But with the end of the Cold War, there was a vacuum in the security area. 9/11 presented a new focus in international terrorism. Terrorism morphed into discussion about crime, which gave us people smugglers, which gave us asylum seekers. And so you can see in the Australian policy processes from around 2001, but reaching an apotheosis really, I think, with Kevin Rudd's national security statement of 2008, a more all-embracing concept in which everything from war fighting to climate change can be considered under a national security blanket, and that had all sorts of consequences, which we can talk about.
Allan Behm, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, well, I'm obviously in agreement with Allan. The easy thing to do is to put as much hyperbole as you possibly can into an issue, elevate it to the top tier of importance, because that gives you the legitimacy and authority for dealing with it. So what we have tended to do, whether it's Operation Sovereign Borders, which is in fact an immigration problem, but turned into a defence problem, and the deployment of warships and of people wearing black uniforms, or whether it is the 2007 response to child sexual abuse in the Northern Territory, which saw the deployment of the Australian Defence Force to deal with what are very, very deep and tricky social and community problems in Northern Australia, not amenable to resolution by Defence Forces at all, but you apply defence because that's what's available to you. I think everybody attending this webinar this morning will cast their minds back to January, when the Prime Minister returned from his rather shortened holiday in Hawaii and was confronted by national bushfires for which the government had no policy response whatsoever. So what did the government do? It called out 6,500 people in the Defence Force. Now, none of those people none of the soldiers were deployed because they're not trained to fight fires. And I think a warship was deployed to get people out of Malakuta. And that probably wasn't such a bad idea. But the fallback position all the time is to head to the top tier policy level, which is national security, and bring anything which you think is important into that frame. And that is what we've begun to call policy by metaphor, because if you misdiagnose a policy problem, then you have no capacity whatsoever to resolve it, because you don't actually know what the problem is. And that, I think, is the problem that we're dealing with more broadly in our public policy in Australia at the moment. So I'm right with Allan on this.
And so, Allan Gyngell, I guess, what are some of the other ways that we've seen this expressed in recent years, and what are some of the problems that it's leading to, in your opinion?
Sorry, what are some of the
more recent examples that we've seen in public policy debate of this phenomena, and why does it cause problems? What kind of issues does it create for policymakers and for public debate in general?
Well, it's really a follow-up to what Allan was just saying, and as he said, bushfires were a recent example, but subsequent to bushfires, of course, we've had the novel coronavirus and the war metaphors that have been framed around this war against the virus. That's a sort of an odd thing, an odd expression to use when you think about it, because the virus doesn't actually know it's at war, and it's at war with you. But the consequence for policy making in all that is to underrate some issues and overrate others. So I think Australia's done pretty well on this with the expertise that's been brought in from health and so on, but the structure in which our initial responses were made was through the National Security Committee of Cabinet. Now, the National Security Committee of Cabinet has fine people on it, but there was very little that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade or the Office of National Intelligence could bring to the table then, compared with the people that you really needed, who of course were health and the social welfare agency services, Australia, and so on. Now, eventually, I think we did get the right people in the room, but it took longer to get there than it should have, because we have been regarding the National Security Committee as the most significant element in the cabinet system. So when prime ministers want to reassure the Australian public, they say, "I've called a meeting of the National Security Committee of Cabinet," and I think that has the desired effect.
Allan Behm, it seems like it is very easy to default to that war metaphor when we're facing complex problems. What's driving that, do you think?
I think that there are a lot of complexities that government is always having to deal with, and it is always in the interests of government to be able to exercise the broadest range of controls that it possibly can, and at the same time, in exercising those controls, to duck and weave around the issues of accountability. It is our practice in Australia for anything that is securitised to become subject to restrictions on information flows and restrictions on accountability. We see that in a court matter, which is currently going through the ACT courts, for example. That the court is not open. We don't know what's happening in that court concerning the bugging of the cabinet room in East Timor. That is deemed a national security issue, and it may well be one. But the fact of the matter is that when you call everything a national security issue, it gives you plenty of scope for not actually being accountable for what you do. And I think that the temptation all the time to avoid accountability while at the same time exercising ever more control over your population, control over events, is extremely tempting for government because it lends to a kind of appearance of governmental efficiency. But I think that the consequence of heading down that track becomes clear when you actually ask people, what is it that they are actually concerned about? And just today, the Australia Institute is releasing the results of a survey that we did on what worries Australians. And it comes as no surprise to me, and I would think as no surprise to Allan either, that what really worries Australians is not those things that fall within the general ambit of what we call national security policy, but things like pandemics, climate change, road accidents. They're worried about violence. But on our take, people are not actually worried about war. They don't think war is going to happen. And what actually kills Australians is not war, but coronary heart disease, diabetes. They're the things that actually do impact on the health and the well-being of Australian citizens. So the tendency all the time to securitise things is not only to miss the point, which is what I said at the beginning, but it is to leave out of the ambit of public policy those things that impact directly on the lives of our citizens. And I consider that to be of concern because it represents a kind of laziness in policy thinking which is not able to deal with the complexity of the issues that actually confronts our population right now.
Allan Gyngell, securitisation, to me, when I think about this concept that we're talking about today, it makes me think most specifically about our response after 9/11 and the way that the threat of global terrorism has led to so many different pieces of legislation curtailing our right to privacy and many other civil rights. And I think what you, Allan Behm, have called the fortification of the national parliament. Anyone can see the bollards and the huge fences that have gone up there. And many of the public service departments around Australia. Do you think that that's where we've seen this phenomenon most evident?
Yes, I think what happened was that security and securitisation were certainly brought home in a visible and concrete sense by the focus on terrorism. Terrorism was never an existential threat to the country in the way that, for example, nuclear war or climate change could be an existential threat, but it involved everyone. And once governments began to want to assure Australians that they were safe, the incentive became more and more to drill down into the everyday lives of Australians, both in an active sense through the legislation looking for access to private communications and so on, and in an external sense through the building of barriers. And it's very difficult once that sort of thing starts to ever go back again, because all you need is one single incident, and claims will be made that if if you're a politician, that you fell down on the job. So the incentive is always to keep in place what you've got and never to back away.
I'll just remind everyone, I think we've got about 670 participants on the line. So thanks everyone for joining us. I can see a couple of questions coming through now. We'll get to those very shortly. And don't forget, you can raise your hand as well if you'd like to ask a question directly of the panel. Allan Gyngell, I'll come back to you again. Obviously with the Black Lives Matter movement, and to a lesser extent in Australia, we've seen the progressive militarisation of the police force, certainly in the United States, where you've got very heavily armed police, often armed with ex-military equipment, including and up to things like tanks, but you know, police officers deploying not only weapons and guns and shooting people in the course of their work, but deploying tasers, tear gas, and those kinds of things against protesters, oftentimes peaceful protesters. I guess, what's driving that? Is it this securitisation that drives that, or is it the other way around in this kind of chicken and egg arrangement? Which comes first?
Yeah, well, I mean, there are clear differences, of course, between the United States and Australia on this, and they're, from my point of view anyway, very, very welcome differences. But the deepest issue here is, I think, not so much the militarisation of the police forces that we've seen in such shocking detail. I mean, I've been astonished by some of the forces that the US police can bring to bear on protesters. But the problem is the militarisation of the society. In a sense, it's the very old, deeply rooted gun ownership and so on in the United States, which has consequences. Whatever you think about particular actions of the police, if police are dealing with a society in which so many people have guns, then they're going to have a different relationship with the public and need different ways of protecting themselves. Now, it's abundantly clear, I think, that nothing is going to be easily done in the United States to address that, but we must work very hard as successive governments in Australia, including John Howard's, have done, to prevent that happening here.
Allan Behm, I think we've spoken about this in the past. You know, the tendency to securitisation has led to the dominance in the policy landscape of, I guess, the intelligence and security community. But you could also argue that the dominance of the intelligence and security community has led to this tendency to securitise the issues. Which side of that do you fall on? And is this a unique Australian phenomenon?
Well, to answer the second one first, Ebony, I don't think it's uniquely Australian at all. I think the precedents have been set in North America and in Europe, frankly, and that we're following suit because we can see models that we can either adopt or, unfortunately, conform to. And I think it's, you've got things which are sort of in dynamic relationships. It's not so much that one comes before the other, but rather that there's mutual reinforcement occurs as you continue to expand that mindset into broader problem solving. As you mentioned, our response to 9/11 has been unique, actually. Australia is the country that has passed most legislation through its parliament, much more than any other comparable democratic country. And that is all of it premised upon the need for the government to be able to preserve the integrity and the authority of the state by making sure that citizens don't get out of control, that citizens don't do the wrong thing. But terrorism is actually not, it's not war. It's sometimes called asymmetric warfare when a weak state wants to use armed force against a strong state, but it's no real threat to the state. So what states do is respond with military force to deal with it, rather than getting down into the socio-economic causes which actually drive terrorism. So if one looks, for example, at the sorts of terrorism we have in the Philippines, the sorts of terrorism that we have in southern Thailand, the sorts of terrorism that we see in Myanmar, these all have deep historical, social and economic roots which actually are not amenable to military force. Military force compounds them, but it will fail and not resolve the problem. So when you look at the other fields in which we are using the military and armed powers of the state, you know, the securitisation of the landscape around Canberra, which is interesting to me, and even, for example, the program that the ABC aired on The Drum last night about facial recognition, that here you have another tool which allows the state to account for the whereabouts and the identity of all its citizens, wherever they happen to be. You just need to have cameras, facial recognition algorithms, and pretty big computers and storage bases to be able to say, well, there goes Allan Behm walking down the street outside Parliament House. I wonder what he's up to. It's a way of looking at social control, which I think really needs to be discussed in this country. And maybe the citizens of Australia would feel more safe and more secure if the tools of things like facial recognition and DNA matching, if these things were to be more broadly distributed. But I'd be surprised if that were the outcome, because in fact, people are generally safer when they're able to manage their private affairs privately. And so the sort of seeping tentacles of securitisation, I think, create a different range of problems for the effective management of democratic practice in democracies. And that's partly why, again, our institute has released a discussion paper today on the issue of securitisation.
I do recall when the Parliament first built those bollards that are now everywhere around Parliament House. I think it was the Greens leader Bob Brown at the time was doing a live interview with ABC 666 in Canberra as the President of the Senate got stuck between the bollards on their first day of operation and had to pop out of the car and walk into Parliament, which was quite funny. But it really all did start from there, and it's only snowballed. So potentially once we head down this type of direction, it's very hard to stop and to pull back that momentum. I'm going to go to questions from the audience now. Murray Proctor, I'll come to you shortly. You can lower your hand if that was accidental, but I'll come to your question shortly. I wanted to start with a question from Libby Boyd, and she asks the Allans, the more the ADF is called upon for issues that are not national security, the more it will become the new norm. That's her thesis. Allan Gyngell, do you agree with that?
Ebony, the more the ADF is called upon
for issues that are not issues of national security, the more that will become the norm for them to be called out for things that they haven't been in the past.
Look, I think that's right. I mean, I think we are very lucky in Australia to have a highly professional defence force. My observation of working with people from the ADF over the years has been great reassurance that if called upon to do the professional tasks for which they are trained, Australian soldiers will do well. the issues for which they were trained. And as Allan Behm was saying before, fighting bushfires ain't it. Staff in hospitals, really in northern Tasmania, is not it. It is an all-purpose response that governments use when they are in trouble, because the ADF can be mobilised quickly, and they look good. And the sight of large warships, floating off the coast of southern New South Wales in a bushfire seemed to send a message that something is being done. When people want something to be done, then the ADF is the way into it. But the effective use of the ADF is always going to be properly very limited, and government should be very careful about the ways in which they try to use the military. We're seeing what can happen at the far end in the United States at the moment.
Allan Behm, I'll come to you on this question next of whether or not this sends us down a path that's hard to come back from. But could you also comment on the legislative changes that have enabled the ADF to be called out to, quote, help the state police without the state requesting it?
Yes, Ebony, that does take us down a rather different path. And I would not be the only person in Australia concerned by that. Certainly, there is concern within the the leadership of the Australian Defence Force itself, and a number of former military leaders have also expressed their concern about moves that might make the Australian Defence Force appear to be a kind of national guard in Australia, where our military forces, which are absolutely and only for the defence of Australia against external threat, are employed to defend whatever it might be against what any government might judge to be an internal threat. And so the issue there, I think, is the much more pernicious creeping politicisation of our Defence Force. Not that the Defence Force becomes itself political and identifies itself according to the political badges of political parties, but rather more that the Defence Force becomes used as a political tool. And that, I think, it would be very alarming because it would not only confront the citizens of Australia, because we are an all-volunteer force. Our ADF actually comes out of the community, and in that sort of rather poetical sense, I suppose, is owned by the community. So you have the community and an arm of the community being used to manage the community. And I think that that is something that we don't want in Australia, and we have to make sure that any use of the Australian Defence Force in circumstances where they are in fact enforcing state laws of one kind or another are very carefully boundaried and are only in those extreme circumstances where the use of very particular military capabilities is necessary for the maintenance of broad public safety. And in my experience, which is pretty extensive on this, I might say, it goes back to the Russell Street bombings, so I do know what I'm talking about here. Those circumstances are extremely rare, and we already have the mechanisms for dealing with them. We don't need to change legislation.
The next question, I'll come to you, Murray Proctor. Are you there? Can you hear me? I think you're on mute.
I can hear you, but it's a software glitch that raised my hand. I'm sorry.
Okay, no, that's all right. I'll lower your hand there, and we'll go Peter Job. I've got you next. I'll come to you in just a moment. Nigel Waters asks, can you reflect on the failure of oppositions in parliaments to hold governments to account on securitisation for fear of being accused of weakness? First to you, Allan Gyngell.
I would have thought first to you, Allan Behm was the appropriate.
I can go to Allan Behm first if you'd prefer.
Nigel has just asked a perfect question. We were formerly colleagues in the Attorney-General's Department, possibly on the opposite sides of an issue. My division in Attorney-Generals was dealing with the Australia card, and as the Privacy Commissioner, Nigel's job was to make sure that the privacy of Australian individuals was not compromised by the sorts of data amalgamation that was envisaged by some who were promoting the Australia card. That by way of background. I think at the heart of Nigel's question is a very fundamental democratic concern, and that is the basic demand on government to protect the rights of the individuals that actually elect that government. And in my estimation, and I hope I'm answering or making the point that Nigel is seeking, in my estimation, governments would seriously default on their duty when the rights of individuals are impinged upon in a way that spreads control across communities, not on the basis of somebody who might legitimately be investigated, but simply on the basis of a broad community suspicion that something might be happening. And once that begins to occur, we're heading down the path of autocracy, quite frankly. And in a democratic society, that has to be fought against, and individual rights have got to be defended to the maximum possible extent.
The next question is from Peter Job. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me okay?
I can. What's your question for the panel?
Well, for 2 decades now, the issue of refugees and asylum seekers has been framed as a national security issue, sometimes severely so. It's been framed as a major threat to Australia, when there's no evidence whatsoever that that is the case. Now, we know that this has caused substantial harm to asylum seekers. Is it also not causing substantial harm to our society? It is increasing xenophobia. It is decreasing curiosity about the actual issues that relate to why refugees have fled in the first place. It made us a less tolerant and in some ways a less democratic society. Would you agree? And what should people who are concerned about this do about it?
Thanks, Peter. First to you, Allan Gyngell.
Well, it's a very good question, and you point to an absolutely social issue for Australia. Yes, look, I agree completely. The framing of refugees and asylum seekers in security terms has been damaging both to the asylum seekers and to Australia. But for the government, from a government's point of view, it did work, and it worked because it spoke to something deep and mysterious in the sort of psyche of the Australian people, possibly coming from the fact that we're an island. The belief that control of our periphery is what everything is all about, and one small boat landing, in northern Queensland is a threat to our national integrity. So I think it was the wrong approach. I think it led to some terribly I'm putting that less strongly than I should be, to some utterly callous responses. But I don't think we can blame governments alone. They were responding to an attitude which is deeply embedded in the community. So the change has to come through community discussions and through the activities and engagement of people across civil society, as well as making demands on the government to change.
Thank you. Richard Maguire, we're going to come to you next, but not quite yet. Allan Behm, what are your thoughts on that refugee issue and the
I'd only add
securitisation
one
of
thing
refugees?
to what Allan said, and it comes, Ebony, out of our polling that we are putting out today, that, and it does go to the last part of Peter's question, which is around xenophobia and sensitivity on matters of race. Our polling suggests that quite a high percentage of Australians are actually concerned about what we call asylum seekers. They're actually refugees under the Convention. And I think that increase in sensitivity is perhaps a result of the very high profile that was attached to the asylum seekers policy, most particularly under the Howard government, but also under the Rudd government, and ever since then. The fact that we would excise bits of Australia from the application of our refugee law is, to me, quite extraordinary, because we do have agency. I mean, these people who arrive in Australia, they don't create a threat to our sovereignty at all. It's simply a problem of how you control access to the country. And all countries have that problem. So I think in response to Peter's question, that issue of securitisation can actually have the perverse effect of creating concern and fear, when in fact there's no need for concern and fear. All of the tools that are necessary for these controls are actually available to us without securitising them.
Thanks, Allan. And just reflecting, yeah, I automatically just jumped into that language of asylum seekers there, even though I've worked on refugee issues for quite a number of years. So, you know, it is all pervasive, and I guess shows how effective that has been in turning it into. What's your question for the panel? Are you there?
Oh. Yeah, your voice dropped out for a minute. Well, thank you, Australia Institute and the two Allans. This has been wonderful to get all these insights into what's going on. I just get very concerned because over the years, it just seems like the government holds all the cards in its hands. It can define anything it wants to as a security issue, and the opposition immediately falls down. They don't want to look weak on security. You know, Labor popped right in with Northern Territory, the whole refugee business and everything else that's gone on because they don't want to appear weak. I just wonder what we as citizens or we as civil society institutions can do at all to unwind this, because it just seems like, you know, the government can simply say it's a security issue and that stops it. There's very little that goes on, except for a few people defined as being progressive or left wing or whatever. So
yeah,
what can we do? What is our what are some hopes we can build on?
Thanks, Richard. I'll come to you first, Allan Behm.
Oh, look, I think we could spend all day talking about this one. It's a fantastic question, Richard. I was giving a presentation last year, and I played a little trick on the people who were there. It was 200 people from the Australian security community, and they were all very, very worried about the decline in our political conversation in Australia. So I asked them the question, how many of them were practitioners of religion? How many went to church, in other words? And surprisingly, it was about a third of the audience who were actually church goers, out of 2/3 who were deep believers. And then I followed that question up by saying, and how many of you actually are supporters of a political party, and how many of you actually are members of political parties? And the result, Richard, won't surprise you. There were 2 people in that room of 200 people who actually were members of a political party, I being one of them, and that was out of an audience of 10 who said that they had a particular political preference. Now, that little anecdote illustrates a very important issue, I think, and that is the disengagement of our community from our political processes. If anything has come out of the problems this week in Victoria, it is that the political processes go on absolutely independent of the communities within which they're going on. So-called power brokers just line people up for $10 a turn to sign on and become members and then determine pre-selections. That's essentially what that's about. So it seems to me, Richard, that what has to happen in this country is that particularly the civil societies, civil community groups have got to be much more engaged in the national conversation about the quality of our national political life and the participation in our national political life by many, many more people. And the second thing I think we need to focus on is not just the conversation about our national political life, but for civil society groups in particular to ramp up their engagement with their political representatives. Go down to their electorate offices, make sure that they meet you, make sure that they listen to what you've got to say, and make sure that they talk about it in the Parliament. Now, generally that's in the adjournment debate, but they've still got to raise your voices. And if they don't, be politically active. That's about all I can say. It is about the politics.
Thanks, Allan. Allan Gyngell, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think that was really excellent advice from Allan. I would simply add that, I mean, it sounds it sounds ordinary, but the role of civil society is to engage more people, and your participation in conversations like this, which now become easier and easier, which is a good thing because the other avenues of access to the media are drying up enormously. So, but participation in issues like this does, in webinars like this, does change the nature and tone of the national conversation in ways that eventually make it necessary for political leaders to respond. So the agenda setting work that all of you are engaged in is really important.
Thank you. The next question's from Amy Haddad, and I'm hoping we can get at least one more question in after this. Amy asks, to what extent is militarised policy metaphor a product of a masculinist or nationalist policy framing and a deliberate ploy to lift and fund some issues above others? Or is it an inability to understand human security as also relating to domestic social cohesion and stability? And she also says that arguably pervasive violence against women, continuing Indigenous disadvantage and broadening economic inequality are all risks to individuals. Allan Behm, first to you on that one.
Look, Amy, I think that's a phenomenal question. And I'd start by saying, I don't think there are any binaries in your question, actually. I think it's all of those things. It's not a question of alternatives. It's a question of all of those things being in play at the same time. There is no doubt that our national security community is incredibly male-dominated. And it is a bad thing. There's not nearly enough gender diversity to start with in the way in which our national security policies are considered and formulated. Far less is there any clear ethnic diversity in the way in which our national security policies are framed and formulated. And I think both Allan and I, having been practitioners in that field, would be absolutely at one on that. It is really the fundamental problem of our national security policy making is that it is so sectionalised, and in that sort of gender sense and ethnic sense, sectarian. And I think that is a fundamental problem in the way in which we conceive our national security. We had a a discussion on the web not all that long ago that Ebony moderated, where we talked about the need for us to rethink our national security and to see national security as being much more about the well-being of the individuals who make up our community, rather than the ability of the state to fight and win wars. Now, it's not that states should be ill-equipped to meet national defence needs. My career was built around that, really. But the mindset that you need in order to legitimise that has to be around the rights and the privileges of being a citizen. And I think that cannot be properly expressed when only half the citizens, the boys, get into the room to talk about it. And of all the boys who are in the room, none of them are really representing any other voice. So I think your question really goes to the heart of our securitisation conversation this morning. Brilliant question, Amy.
Thank you. Allan Gyngell, did you want to respond to that as well?
Just to repeat some of that. I mean, Amy set out a series of things. The answer to almost all of life's questions is all of the above, and never more so than in reply to Amy's questions. I think there is, and the centrality of the war metaphor to so much public life in Australia does represent a highly masculinist view of the world, and the critique coming out of feminist writers on this is dead right.
We might have to wrap it up there, I'm afraid. I want to thank everyone for all of their questions, and there is so many unanswered, so perhaps we'll do another one of these webinars in future that we can get to a few more of them. But thank you, Allan Gyngell, and thank you, Allan Behm, both of you, for your time today. And thank you, everyone, for your excellent questions. I'll make sure that Allan Behm gets a copy of them all, for his future papers and webinars and events that we run as part of our International and Security Affairs program. I think there's been a lot of excellent issues raised today that we haven't had time to necessarily delve into, including, and not only, the Witness K and Bernard Collaery prosecution, the secret trial that's happened in Canberra, facial recognition, amongst many other very interesting topics. So thank you so much for all your excellent questions today. If you enjoyed today's webinar, we do run these regularly, so please join us next Wednesday at 11 AM when we'll be talking to Richard Dennis, our Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, about his new analysis on the reconstruction and asking whether Australia is going to build back better or just bigger, and what are some of the shared principles that we could all start from when moving forward. And the day after that, on Thursday, June the 25th, at 11 AM, we'll be talking about the success of Aboriginal-led health responses to this pandemic with Leslie Nelson, CEO of the Southwest Aboriginal Medical Service, Professor Sandra Eads, Dean of Curtin Medical School, Associate Professor Dan Macaulay, who's the Director of the Centre for Improving Health Services for Aboriginal Children at Edith Cowan University, and Francine Eads, who's Chair of the Derbarl-Yerrigan Health Service. That'll be in conversation with Australian of the Year, Professor Fiona Stanley, and patron of the Telethon Kids Institute, and Chief Economist at the Australia Institute, Richard Dennis. And you can register for both of those webinars at tai.org.au/webinars. And also to remind you, a video recording of today's webinar will be sent to everyone who registered. So that should pop up in your email, hopefully later today, if not tomorrow. If you are in a position to chip in a few dollars to help cover the costs of these webinars, which are not free to host, but which we do provide free to you, please, all donations are gratefully accepted at our website, tai.org.au/donate, because every little bit helps, and we love to be able to continue putting these on. And just a reminder, that's almost the end of financial year, and donations to our research fund are tax deductible. Also, make sure you subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money, which you can find on iTunes or wherever you normally find you and listen to your podcasts. And please stay 1.5 meters away, keep washing those hands, and thanks for listening. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.